Hi everyone, this is Toby from the International Association for Political Science Students, and today we are here at the annual convention from the ISA in San Francisco. I'm very happy to have with me today Valeria Bello.
Hello Tobias, nice to see you.
Valeria Bello is from the United Nations University and will talk today about her current research on migration in Europe.
Yes.
My first question is, you've started working on migration even before 2014, 2015. Has the research landscape changed since you started working on migration, or what has changed?
Well, it has changed perhaps because now it's a very trendy topic. So I hope there are many people there watching this video. So hello everybody, in case you're there. But yes, it has changed for this reason because it became quite trendy, particularly after 2014 when there was an increase in the arrival of refugees, particularly from Syria, the Syrian conflict, but also there were still refugees from Kosovo, so from precedent conflicts, and from Iraq. So actually all these different people were forced to move because of conflicts, then somehow made this a very trendy topic, very hotly debated on the media, particularly in Europe, where there has been this perception that there was quite a huge increase in the presence of refugees, which is something that actually I tend to criticize, because we've had the same situation in the 90s after the Gulf War and the Balkan Wars. So we have already witnessed a similar situation in Europe with exactly the same debate in the media. So what I normally say is that we are actually in a recurrent series of crises rather than a new refugee crisis in Europe. But yeah, I've been working in this field for many years. And last year I published a book, International Migration and International Security, where prejudice is a global security threat, that has sort of summarized the research I've done during these 10 years. And it's an holistic approach to the topic. So taking into account both the issues that concern the integration of migrants in receiving countries, but also the reason for which persons are forced to flee their places, both for human-made disasters or climate change or wars and conflicts. And I've tried to give an overarching glance to the topic through the book.
Before moving to the next topic, I also want to invite all our viewers that we have right now to ask their questions. So if you have any question or any concern that you want to come up with, please join us with this in the comment bar as well. And you have just mentioned that you worked recently on stereotypes and prejudices. And I think this is one of the most interesting things to observe over time in Europe right now. I'm interested, has the character of prejudice and stereotype changed during the last 4 or 5 years in Europe against immigrants, or has it just intensified, like the prejudice and the stereotypes that have been there? So what kind of dynamics do you observe there?
Well, the kind of stereotypes that are on migration and migrants in general are always the same. I think they've always been the same for the last 3-4 decades, and I guess it's the consequences of meeting the others. So for some people who are not accustomed to, that are not used to have so many contacts with different persons, and sort of consider that the normality in a country is their own culture and the situation as it has always been. So it's this sort of conservative kind of glance that is what creates specific stereotypes about the presence of others. And so the content of these stereotypes has not changed that much along the years. What we can see is that then each specific discourse in each moment is contextualized to the historical momentum that has lived in a country or in the world in general. What I tend to do is to consider what are the global changes in the international arena and in the world more generally that have affected this specific contextualization. So what we can see recently is that because, of course, of the clash of civilizations that has been highlighted in recent decades, many of these new stereotypes have contextualized the old prejudice towards others as a specific prejudice towards specific groups, like religious minority groups, in particular Muslim communities, and we have actually seen the contextualization of xenophobia into Islamophobia in specific countries. But also we have, unfortunately, the revival of a series of biological forms of racism that are not only specific to Europe, but also to other continents, the US, but Africa as well, or Asia. We have this sort of Eurocentric idea or Western-centric idea that prejudice, racism, xenophobia exist only in Europe and the Western world, but actually everywhere unfortunately, there's racism and xenophobia and prejudice. I remember last year in April we had at the UN headquarters a panel series on xenophobia, where there were different colleagues, fellow colleagues from UNU, who were presenting their research to ambassadors and representatives of states in New York. And there was a colleague, Maluleke, which if it's there, I want to create. Hi, Maluleke. She was presenting her research on xenophobic movements and racism in Africa. And people are always surprised to know that racism exists everywhere, but unfortunately that is the case. But still, the prejudice is always the same. The fact that when others are coming, they sort of threaten the culture and economic and political context and where the society lives. Whatever is then the specific situations of the specific minority group that is taken into account, but there is always this feeling that there is a threat that others pose to our culture, to our society, to our political sphere. And each time, then this is contextualized in a specific minority group or a specific cultural religion group. But the reason for that is always this perception of threats by parts of others that is always misled. I mean, there are many unscrupulous leaders, I would say, that tend to scapegoat others for problems that societies have for their own reasons. And unfortunately, there are persons who take advantage of the presence of others for blaming someone else for these problems. And the frustration of society is fundamentally the background that allows that discourse to be successful. So yeah, that is why I look at the European values and why these and the European project and why this is important in Europe today to explain what is the current rise in prejudice.
So that brings us closer to what you're researching right now, because you're asking the question where exactly within the political project of the European Union might be the problem for this amount of xenophobia and populism having a chance to have a rise. What are your answers when looking on the political project of the EU and how it might be part of the problem when we are thinking about how xenophobia rises?
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to understand that a longitudinal glance and take into account the changes that have happened in the international system since the 90s. So I understand the rise of prejudice in the climate of the securitization of migration in that sense. And why the 90s? Because in the 90s there have been several reasons and several changes in the international system that have particularly affected Europe politically. I mean, of course, the end of the Cold War has meant a reconfiguration of what were the main elements that shaped politics at international levels. So before there was this ideological fight between the liberal world and the communist world, but with the end of the Cold War, this specific divide in politics has changed from the ideological sphere to the ethnic sphere. So we have had the interpretation of Huntington, the famous clash of civilization that I quoted also before, but also the ethnicizations of several conflicts around the world. We have, for example, to consider that the same Afghanistan war from a local conflict and then changed into a national conflict and into regional conflict and then into a world conflict. But in the 90s, we have witnessed an ethnicization of that conflict that before was an ideological conflict between different classes, different part of the Afghanistan societies that then became an ethnic conflict between different ethnic groups. So I remember in 95 there was a publication that looked at the Afghanistan conflict, and they said the authors highlighted this turn into the conflict, saying they're using now ethnicities as a powerful tool, as powerful a tool as Kalashnikov. So it is actually true that after the 90s, several conflicts, not only the Afghanistan one, were treated and managed along ethnic lines. Even the Balkan conflicts in the 90s were managed along ethnic lines. And this has meant for Europe a specific change in its politics towards ethnicities, but also in the ideological component of the European Union itself, the European Union project. The European Union project has always been one that has had at the core of its social component, the European welfare state. But with the end of the Cold War, what has happened is that the social focus that the European welfare state had was sort of dismantled. And the European Union became more tended to have more privatization, more focus on the liberalization of several politics and policies. And in particular, the European welfare state was sort of dismantled in many countries with the privatization of the health sector, the public education. The public education has also received less funds than in the past. So there were several cuts to these two important pillars of the European welfare state, the public health system and the public education system, with funds particularly to private health system and private education. So this, in my last research, was connected to the rise of prejudice with a statistical analysis, comparative analysis of different countries in Europe. And actually in the data you can see that it is statistically significant, not so much the presence of migrants and the increase of the presence of migrants to the rise of prejudice, but the cuts to the public health and public education systems and the rise of xenophobic attitudes towards migration. So it is, to connect to what I was saying before, it became a way, the presence of migrants became a way to sort of explaining certain disadvantages that the poorest sectors of the society were experiencing by scapegoating the presence of migrants, because migrants were actually those who went to live to this district that has suffered more of the cuts in public health system and public education system. So for the persons who were living in this poor district, were more vulnerable than other parts of the societies, it became a sort of self-explaining the presence of migrants and the disadvantages that they were noticing in their life. But actually, many of these situations were created by a lack of funds to these two important sectors that are actually at the core of the European welfare state. That is a very important component of the European Union project. So what I claim is that the current frustration that there is in societies can be explained through those specific cuts to these two important pillars of the European welfare state, and but instead this frustration has been used to blame migrants for those problems. And this could explain why, for important campaigns like the Brexit one, migration was one of the most important, hotly debated topics, and why the migration as a topic has been connected to a campaign on the remaining or leave the European Union project.
We actually have a question that is also on the Brexit. Will Joshua asks, how does the exit of the United Kingdom affect the migration policies of the EU? Do you see any change there?
Well, the Brexit will have, and is having already, many important consequences for the European Union in several ways, and on the UK as well, of course. If it will change, or it has changed, the European Union policies to migration, I don't think it is the case. I think the European Union has its own policy on migration that is actually already a sort of compromise between what is the political will of the member states, the different European Union member states, and the European Union as a political project. So we have to consider that the European Union actually has a motto that is unity in diversity. And there was actually a committee of the European Parliament that have tried to collect best practices on migration, and has tried to see what were the weakest point, the main weak point in the route to Europe of refugees, how to deal with all these issues. But this is the European Parliament. Then the European Commission has its own agenda on migration and its way of dealing with migration. And then there is the European Council that makes agreement with third countries and decides how to manage the refugee crisis or the migration route. So the exit of the UK from the EU would not affect that policy in that sense, because it is already a compromise of all the different European Union member states. So in that sense, I don't see the exit of the UK as something that will affect the EU policy, but it will have a very important impact on the UK policy towards migration, because, and we have already witnessed that. And in that sense, yes, it will affect instead the UK policies quite a lot.
We have one more question from Vasily. He asks, do you see a connection between the emergence of social networks and the rise of racism?
Well, I think social networks can show us what is the new expression of racism in the world, and can perhaps give it more relevance because it's able to connect different groups across the globe and perhaps render them more visible than before. But it's not that social networks can increase racism. I think racism is a phenomenon that exists in the society, and then social networks are ways to show what's happening in the society through a network, but they don't create the phenomenon themselves.
Okay, but it may be able to connect groups or certain milieus that are unsatisfied with policies by the EU and then turn racist or xenophobic, has this connective factor, right, throughout different countries.
Yes, but it has the social network has the power to connect, of course, different groups. But if this can increase their activity is something that I don't think is the case. What can happen is that this network can then help better organize particular form of protests. And then these protests can have an impact. So, for example, all specific actions and activities that they engage in can then, if better organized, can have an impact on the rise of racism. One example of that is, for example, what had happened during the summer with Defend Europe and this attempt to cover this operation of blocking the migrants, the refugees in the Mediterranean with a different flag, like the one of defending Europe from this invasion of persons who were fleeing war and conflicts. So the organization of this specific action was very interesting because it has used social networks quite a lot. So there were different groups of white supremacists, particularly in France, Austria, Germany, and Italy, who joined their forces through the social network and have organized this operation in the Mediterranean. Actually, I don't think it has in any way been successful because we can't see an increase after that, an increase of white supremacist presence in the normal debate in the public sphere. But what has happened is, interestingly, that has not been highlighted in the media so much as it deserved, was the civil society response to that action that was really strong in all the countries, in Italy, in France, in Austria, and in Germany. Civil society has responded quite strongly to that action, and several civil society groups have emerged in reply to that situation. What is instead able to increase prejudice is the discourse of leaders in national context, and in fact in Europe, by also using this example of Defend Europe, some political parties have taken advantages of the specific momentum that is created in the media to then scapegoat civil societies, and particularly NGOs. And we have recently seen the very unfortunate criminalization of civil society solidarity towards migrants. So in that sense, I don't think social networks can increase xenophobia or racism themselves, but if well used, they can be used to organize specific protests, and these protests can then engender some consequences.
Yeah. Will has asked us something regarding the securitization that you were also drawing upon several times. He asks, the reforms of the Dublin system, also known as Dublin IV, have already passed the European Parliament, but it struggles at the European Council. How do you assess the success of the Dublin IV now that Mrs. Angela Merkel called for it to be passed at the European Council?
Yeah, this shows very clearly what I was saying before, that in Europe there is already a compromise, when, particularly when we consider the migration field. There is an important compromise that happens at the European level, because we're dealing with different member states which have different interests and different ideas and opinions about migration, and about the responsibility to protect, the responsibility taken with the Refugee Convention, the Geneva Convention. So states interpret in different ways the responsibility at international level, particularly when it comes to human security, the human security of those who flee these places, and the international security. I've recently written a chapter, but it's in Spanish language, in a book of the Ministry of Defense, the Spanish Ministry of Defense, in which I claim that there is no reason for which the human security and the national security and the international security need to be in tension. So actually, by ensuring the human security of persons, we can also ensure the national security and the international security, because it's in the interest of everybody that that people have their human rights guaranteed. So if there is even one single person in this world who doesn't see his human rights respected, that becomes a threat to the entire world, because when the human security doesn't exist for a specific group, then this will have effect for everybody. And so for that reason, I say at the European level, there are different interpretations of what are the responsibility to protect when it comes to the human security, the national security, and the international security. Not all states and governments think that the human security is not in tension with the national security and the international security. There are some countries that actually have the perception that to guarantee the national security, sometimes the human security of some persons needs to be set aside. Yeah. That is absolutely wrong as a concept, according to me. But at the European Union, what happens is that the European Union is very sensitive towards the issue of the human security and the respect of human rights, of course. But there is this compromise between different states that makes it difficult to have a clear politics in the field of migration with a very coherent policy program.
So does that mean that the European Union has to become more sensitive? Because you have drawn upon different kind of reforms, so neoliberal economic reforms, security reforms, and those reforms are not made by xenophobic parties, but are decided by.
It depends what's the government in place.
Oh yeah, but by looking at the European Parliament, we have a majority that decides on those reforms that consists of many different parties from many different political areas, spectrums. So do you think that it is that these parties from the center of the European political parliament have to become more sensitive towards the effect of deciding on those economic and security programs, because are not intending to be xenophobic, but they play into the hands of xenophobic, and they therefore become complicit somehow in this subject?
In this situation, yeah. What I think that we need, and that particularly policymakers need, is an overarching glance at the issue of migration. We cannot take into account migration only as an external situation, like the arrival of refugees or migrants, and keep it separated from what happens within the society, because when these persons, newcomers, arrive in a country, they will join the society. And when they join the society, they join a society that already has minority groups, that already has a new generation of citizens which have who have different thoughts, different visions for the world. So we have to consider the migration both from the external movements of those who are forced to flee a country or who actually have the possibility to choose migration as a route to have a better life, with the integration of migrants within societies, and what is the social particular domain of a country, and what are the specific needs of that society that is composed of both the established and the newcomers and the different minority groups. So of course, when we take a decision in the social domain or in the political domain, this will have consequences, will entail consequences in different spheres, and particularly will also affect the migration field. So we definitely need to have an holistic approach when we deal with migration.
Thank you very much. I think these were some great insights into your work, and we were very glad also for you raising your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. And
thank you for inviting me to this excellent program. I've really enjoyed to be here in this interview, but I've seen that you have a schedule of very interesting interviews in this program. So congratulations for the initiative. And thank you all for your interesting questions and comments. I hope you have enjoyed this talk.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye.